Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover.
Hey, good morning, everybody. And there you go. My guest reversed me today. That's the first time in over 80 interviews that the guest started off with the musical interlude. Anyway, hope program will be totally different, just like we started it, because I'd like to do something today that we haven't done in the past. And I'll tell you what that is. But before we get into it, let me tell you, all of you out there, or if you're a first time listener, please subscribe to the program and press that bell so you get notified when we have new videos on. And the other thing is this: if you'd like to support this program, and I would appreciate it very much, please become a Patreon. And it's very much appreciated. You know, we have no sponsors, so we're working on our own dimes. Anyway, enough business out of the way. Another thing. As you can see, if you have seen me before, I used to have hair. Well, I started losing it, so I figured, the hell with that. I shaved my head, so I have that Bruce Willis look right now, and I'm going to save on haircuts. So here's what today's show is going to be about. Many of you out there who are watching this are ex-Scientologists. You've gotten in and you came to your senses and just said, this is not right, so you left. But when you got in, you had certain aspirations that got you into Scientology. Maybe the first one was you wanted to help yourself handle something. Many of us have done that. And then after you saw that the earlier stuff, which in the very beginning, as I've said many times in this program, is helpful, you decided, hey, wait a minute. If this helped me, I'm going to get others to do this to help themselves get better or achieve things they'd like to achieve. And then maybe after that, you started saying, oh, wait a minute. What is all this about? What is life about? You know, who am I? And what's the story? Is there a universal mind? Is there a God? Is there this? So you started looking at other types of philosophy. And what we're going to do today is explore those different things. And with me, I have a very special guest who I consider to be one of the brightest people I know. And Brian, I'm not trying to borrow money from you. I mean that sincerely. This guy has a different take on a lot of things. So good morning, Brian, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Ron. It's really a pleasure to be with you, a fellow brother traveler in the spirit.
Okay. So look, I have some notes here that we did because we went over what we were going to talk about earlier on the phone. And the first thing I'd like to take up is a subject called blind believers and blind doubters, and the same psychological profile. What's your take on some of these things?
Well, actually, I have to thank the blind doubters for helping me to see it, because we all know what it was like to be a blind believer. When we were in Scientology, blind belief to me meant that anybody that countered.
Yeah, hang on a second, Brian. I hate to do this in the middle of the show, but you're going to have to get a little bit closer to your microphone because you're not coming off as loud as I'd like you to be.
How's this? This better?
That's a lot better. People are going to hear you a lot better. Okay, buddy. So continue.
Okay. So when we were all in the cult, basically blind belief was what Ron demanded of all of us, though we didn't call it that at the time. And then when you had blind belief, that blindness caused us to counter anybody that doubted what we were talking about as bad. It was like it's an absolute fixed idea to have blind belief. There's no questioning it at all. There's just, this is the way it is, and that's it. So now there are some ex-Scientologists that I have found that have become blind doubters, and it's the same mindset. It's now, it can't be true. So in the beginning, when we were blind believers, it must be true. And now that the betrayal was so colossal that they maybe feel so embarrassed that they actually, were part of something so mindless. So now they look at it and they consider themselves scientific and reasonable and evolved intellectual people. And they see anything that has to do with the spiritual reality as bunk. But they deal with it with the same fixity as blind believers, except now they're blind doubters. So anytime you mention anything positive about spiritual nature, they feel it's their duty to prove you wrong and to show how your reasoning is wrong, just like how blind believers, like if you were to go over to a Christian and talk about how, or fundamentalist Christian, and talk about maybe the good parts of Gautama Buddha, they would never accept it because in their world, Gautama Buddha is probably Satan or the devil or whatever. So they have this fixed idea that everything gets filtered through it. It's the same thing with blind doubters. You bring up anything in the spiritual reality and they see it in the same way, in the same fixed idea. Now, I have had friends that I've had conversations with that were atheists and materialists, but I had great conversations with them. The one lasted for 2 hours and we had a great time. We loved each other and I enjoyed the conversation. But there are some atheists and materialists, when you have a conversation with them, you feel like they're condescending to you. And I feel that you could feel like they're making less of who you are. So basically, so here's the idea. The idea is a blind believer and a blind doubter is the same psychological profile, except it's reversed. They're still the highest thing that a materialist and an atheist could say is, I don't know if God exists or not. I don't know if spiritual realities exist or not. Because how can they say, no, God does not exist? Just like a blind believer who maybe has no experiences with direct experience, they just believe these things. They can't necessarily say, I know God exists, just like the other ones can't say, I don't know God exists. Both of them have one thing in common. They both don't know. And therein lies what I think spirituality begins, in knowledge and direct perception.
Well, let me tell you something. You mentioned about being condescending, and that is one common denominator of anybody who's been a Scientologist for a while. They have an arrogant or condescending view of those who are non-Scientologists, and they feel that they have all the answers, and they almost pity people who aren't in Scientology because they think, well, they call them raw meat or wogs, and based on their fixed idea that they know it all, anything that goes against that belief would be beneath them. Do you see what I'm saying?
Completely. And that's what materialists have the same, or at least ones that are intellectual elitists, that they think they know, just like the Scientologists. They have the same attitude towards believers or people that have a spiritual reality. You could feel that, oh, you think like this. I'm so rational, and I need for people to see how rational I am.
Yeah, well, and then you talked about the existence of a supreme being or a God. Look, I have a slightly different take on this, or maybe it's the same take as people who say I believe in God. But my point is this. I personally believe, and I'll come right out in the open with this, that there is a universal mind. And this universal mind permeates everything. You, the planets, the grass, little squirrels, the solar system, all solar systems, it permeates it. And so I guess I've looked at this from a very simplistic way and thinking this. If I were to take a little acorn, a little inert piece of organic, and it is organic, it's not a rock, and that acorn could be 5 years old, it could be 1 month old, just fell off the tree, put it in the ground in fertile soil, and eventually that oak tree who was sleeping in that acorn will pop through the soil and start to grow. Take another simple example. Take an ear of corn and look at all the kernels on it. Each kernel has a little silk thing coming from it. If you were to take one of them and put it in the ground in fertile soil and give it some nourishment and sunlight, eventually a stalk of corn would grow with many of those ears of corn, each one containing little kernels, and each kernel could do the same thing. That isn't something that is normal if you are a materialist and you think it would grow out of a rock. There's something there called life, and that life has to be imbued somewhere along the line, and that's where I feel there is a universal mind. I hope I haven't gone
No, no,
off the rails in explaining that, because that's how I feel.
to me, that's, in fact, that is the view of every spiritual tradition. That intelligence is everywhere. I mean, if you look at everything, if you look at the laws of electromagnetism, you look at the laws of gravity. We eat food, we chew it, and then the body knows where to break up the chemicals and send it to different muscles, and the you know that the core of our planet is this solid iron spinning, which creates magnetism that stops the sun from destroying the earth with the solar winds. I mean, everything is in this incredible balance. And to say that this phenomenal artistry of nature is the product of chaos and a mistake, it's like saying that the Mona Lisa just painted itself. To me, to not perceive that intelligence that you were talking about, because really what you're talking about is an inherent intelligence in nature that knows what to do. That seed has an inherent intelligence that knows that it should grow into a tree. And to not see the artistry of nature, to me, is blind faith. They're blindly believing in their thinking, because ultimately the five senses cannot perceive everything that in nature. I mean, if it wasn't for the electron microscope, we would not know about the atom. So the five senses by themselves cannot perceive these things. I completely agree with you. I look around me and I am astounded at the beauty and the elegance of the universe. And I cannot, how could something that's created not have a creator? How can a painting not have a painter? To me, that's just irrational.
Yeah, I mean, look at Mozart. When he was 6 years old, he was writing symphonies. Do you think that's a combination of brain cells that wrote those symphonies? If you do, you'd buy a hot dog stand in a Holland Tunnel. I mean, you're oblivious to reality there, you know?
Yes, and in the East, they say that, if you take a look at reincarnation, when you go to sleep and you wake up the next day, you're not a different person. You're the same person with the talents that you worked on before. So the idea of reincarnation is like, you are still the same person. You are still the same individual. Maybe your external forms are different, but you come in with the same talents. How could somebody be born, with no legs and with mental problems, and other people with a silver spoon in their mouth? There has to be some rationality to it. If the universe is intelligent, then things wouldn't be haphazard. Even our personalities, we work on our personalities. We personally develop our personality. So if somebody has artistic genius in a birth, then where did that come from? Is the universe haphazard? Oh, you're just lucky because you got cells or genes from mom and dad or whatever. But that doesn't really answer it for me. I can only answer those things in my mind rationally, that there is a continuity of life that goes beyond just one body. And
I'll tell you, you bring up a good point, because there was a whole bunch of writers in the late 1800s, and it was called the New Thought Movement. Writers like Atkinson and Charles Hannell and people like that. And they talked about actually many things that L. Ron Hubbard talked about in Scientology. There are things there's a book called The Master Key System. And in there's exercises that you do that L. Ron Hubbard cut and paste and made part of Scientology. But he put a different agenda to it. Eventually, the agenda in Scientology is to make money for the group and have it to become powerful, and use organizational penalties like disconnecting your family from you to make you obey them. That was not part of these people who wrote these books in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Brilliant people. And if you read these, there's many different takes on reincarnation. That is, like there's a Chinese belief that you only get reincarnated every 1,500 years. There's another one and I think it's an Eastern religion, that if you really hurt something bad, or you're cursed with having to reincarnate up to the point of being a human being again, you would start as a bug, and you'd have to have 83 reincarnations of different forms all the way up to the point where you reincarnate as a person. So many people have explored this, but what is your take? What gives you certainty that this is true?
Uh, well, first of
I mean,
all,
is there any one thing, or is there a lot of things, or what?
no, there is one. Well, I've had a lot of things, but there's a few key things. First of all, just like the person that was born, like Mozart was born, that he was able to write symphonies at 17. I came into my life as Brian with these interests ever since I was very, very, very young. I don't even remember a time when I wasn't interested in this. But yes, there are a few things that occurred to me. One, let's just talk about the existence of the soul, or an incorporeal self, because that's really the crux of the argument. The individual soul and God. Those are the two subjects that people usually argue about: the soul and God, the existence of the soul and God. So I've been meditating all my life. Even when I was in Scientology, I used to sneak meditation, and I would get in trouble ethics-wise, for doing it. So I was interested in these things even before Scientology. But I want to just share one experience I had in meditation, maybe about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. I don't know. It was a while, but it was significant enough to want to communicate. So in meditation, basically the goal of meditation is to neutralize the oscillations of thought and emotion, the wavelength of thought and emotion, to still them, not to suppress them, but to still them. When you go on vacation, you still your mind a little bit from the worries of life, so everybody
Yeah,
knows what it's like to still their emotions and still their mind, but meditation is a mind vacation. So this one particular meditation, I really did a good job at stilling the mind and stilling the emotions. And this is what happened to me. So all of a sudden, I'm sitting there in complete stillness. And out of nowhere, all of a sudden, this ecstatic feeling just started rising up in me. And then I was overwhelmed by this feeling of love. I mean, it was overwhelming. When you're in love with a person, you can't deny it. It's like
yeah,
overwhelming. And
absolutely.
I was experiencing overwhelming love. And then my intellect kicked in, because it was very still before. And my mind kicked in and went, wait a minute, I'm experiencing love and there's nobody there. I'm not in love with anybody. There's no person. I'm not thinking about, I got $1 million. I'm happy now. There was no object. It was just me being still as Brian. And then I realized, oh, that's me. I'm looking at me. I'm looking at me without the filters of the material world. I'm looking at me without the filters of my noisy mind and my noisy emotions and my noisy body with pains and blah, blah, blah. And I'm experiencing this beautiful peace. And then my mind went, that's the soul. I'm experiencing the soul, because it was causeless. There was no cause for this love. I didn't have love because of something. And in that moment, I realized that my nature, our nature, is causeless being and causeless well-being that does not need an external source for that sense of well-being. And that was the first time in my life where the experience of the soul became my knowledge. It wasn't a belief anymore. My teacher talked about it a million times, but it was book knowledge at that point. It was still like intellectuality. It was just the thoughts about things. But that was the moment that I realized I am that. And it was the practice of meditation that I learned that brought me into a position, just like an electron microscope puts the scientist in the position of being able to perceive the atom. My mind could have never figured that one out, but I did the proper experimentation and I was able to see. And then my mind said, aha, that's the soul. So then that became my knowledge. I didn't need to believe in God anymore. I didn't need to believe in the soul anymore. People could tell me that I was an idiot, for thinking like that. It didn't matter. If I look at my brown shoes and I see that there are brown shoes, and somebody comes up to me and says, Brian, you're deluded for seeing your brown shoes. What happens in my mind is, no, I see my brown shoes. There's something wrong with you for not seeing my brown shoes. Therefore, let me be compassionate, because you just don't understand. So that was one of the key experiences I had about my own spiritual nature. And then I realized we're all like that, and that was the answer to that big cliche, the happiness lies within. That day, I realized that for the first time in my life. And ever since, I've not allowed myself to be tricked to find happiness in impermanence in the outside world. I seek it, I
Yeah.
want, yeah. So anyway, I hope that wasn't too much.
No, that's true. And it has to be a personal experience. Like you can say, I believe in something, but if you know it, that's a different level.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things that they talk about in these books is that space or distance is not a factor in knowing something that's a distance away or being able to communicate in some fashion to something that's a hell of a distance away. I have a short example, but there's another one where my wife, when we were in the Sea Organization, she was on mission, and she had to go to Hungary she was on a mission about delivering books and paraphernalia to different Scientology organizations in Europe. She was supposed to have gone to Italy, but then was sent to Hungary. I had no knowledge of her being sent to Hungary. And this, I know that people are going to hear this and say, who the hell are you kidding? Well, I found out what hotel she was in, and I called her in Hungary. And there's another smaller one that happened that involves something shorter distance. In 1974, I recorded an album for Polydor Records. The album was called Freewheelin', and it's on my website right now under Timeless, and you can hear the different pieces that are recorded. That's almost besides the point. We were recording this album in London, and we had recorded 3 sample pieces, and I was in London on foot, going around to the different record companies, speaking to the A&R men. A&R is artist and repertoire. These are the guys that would say, okay, we'll give you a deal. You play something that you have. And I was going around, and I had some sample recordings, and I wanted to play them for people. Meanwhile, at the studio at Audio International, they were doing final mixes on 3 of the pieces. And I'm walking down the street, going to the next record company, and I thought, I have to call the studio. I called the studio, and I said, let me speak to Graham Todd. That was the producer. Graham got on the phone. He said, Ronnie, I'm so glad you called. We just erased a track that you did about a minute ago.
Wow.
And I went to the studio and re-recorded it.
Wow.
Now, there's no mechanical reason, or you could say it's a coincidence. It is a coincidence that it happened a minute ago. I had an urge, or as people would say, an intuition or intuitive desire to do something. I follow these things through, and I would say in almost 100% of them, I'm correct. And when I don't follow them, I regret it. But that was my instant of there's no space doesn't mean anything, or somebody mechanically telling you, hey, you got to do this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've had countless events like that because there's so many of them, I don't consider them supernatural anymore. I actually consider it supernatural for people to not have them, to tell you the truth. Because I really do, because I mean, everybody has those things. You could call it coincidence if you want, and they are coincidence. They are incidents that happen together. The question is, did they happen out of chaos, or did they happen out of some magnetic attraction, out of some resonance between 2 people? I'll give you one. When my mother saved my life through this power that you just talked about, this intuition. This was during the 60s, before I was interested in spirituality, and I was doing a lot of drugs, and this was even before the hippie days. And I was running in street gangs in New York, and I was getting into a lot of trouble and doing bad things. And this one particular night, I had taken what we used to call two-and-alls back then. They were like these barbiturates. I took two-and-alls and I drank beer, which now, you look back on the 60s, a lot of the stars died from that combination, and they died in their sleep throwing up. So this is what happened. So I went home really completely stoned out, and I went to my top bunk bed to go to sleep. Well, my dad was a musician like you. He played trumpet, and he, cared for the family and paid for our education by being a musician. So my mom slept alone at night when my dad played in Manhattan in the clubs. And my mom and dad's bedroom was way down the hall, and our doors were closed. And my mother told me she woke up in the middle of the night, about 2 a.m. She pops up and she said, "What's the matter? Something's not right. Something's wrong." She gets up out of her bed. She opens her door. She goes down the hall where our bedroom is. She opens up the door. She goes in, and she sees that I'm laying down on my back on the top bunk throwing up, which is how people suffocate. And so I was throwing up. My mom drags me down, cleans me off, watches me all night until I fell back to sleep again. I don't remember that because I was too high at that time. But what was that? My mom saved my life as a result of some intuitive nudge that woke her up from a dead sleep. She could not have heard anything because our doors were closed, and I was down the hall. And anyway, I was just throwing up, on my face. So my mother saved my life because of that power. For somebody to say that was coincidence, to me, lacks reason.
Well, let me tell you, I will bet everybody listening to this program has had some incident in their life that was similar to the things we talked about. Not the same, but very, very similar, because there's so many people I've talked to about things like this and say, I'll tell you something that happened to me one time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's commonplace, but in the everyday activity of our life, trying to make a living, to feed your family or yourself or be successful at something, sometimes we dismiss these things. Yet this is the very heart and soul of life itself, your spirituality. Because, listen, I have a very good friend who owns a nightclub, and I play there. And he said to me, my mother, I was with her, the very moment she died, it was a different thing. She was no longer there. In other words, once she left that body, that shell, he said that was no longer my mother laying there. She was gone.
You know what? And there is what you just said in language. She was gone. And that's the difference between materialists and people with a spiritual perspective. Materialists only give credibility to the observable, to the objects. They don't consider that the observer exists, the subjective. And to me, that's an imbalance, because in every sentence you have a subject and an object. How could there not be an observer? Well, I think that the reason that people are stuck in not being able to see these things is because they haven't done the experimentation, or they haven't had the experience to be able to see the observer. Just like we can see objects, that experience in meditation that I had, I was able to observe me, the subject.
Right.
I was the observer. I'm the one who sees. I'm the one who witnesses things. And materialists just believe in the things, but they don't believe that there's anybody there witnessing it or seeing it or perceiving it, which to me is like, how could you say that? How could you brand a human being, this beautiful thing, this creature, even animals and cats and birds, that there's not something greater within them than just, a conglomeration of molecules and cells? That's irrational in my mind.
Well, there's an exercise you can do, and that's this. If you would close your eyes and get a picture of a cat, and with your eyes closed, describe the cat to me. And people out there, you can do this. Just close your eyes, get a picture of a cat in your mind, and describe the cat. Okay? And tell me about it. Okay, describe the cat.
It's my beautiful kitty that passed on a few years ago. She is a little chubby, doesn't eat a lot, very chubby, but a beautiful face. Um, yeah, my beautiful kitty cat. I could see her.
Okay, open up your eyes. Okay, your eyes were closed, right?
Hmm.
Who was looking at the cat?
Exactly.
There was the observer. Who was looking at the cat?
Exactly.
And if you just do that, as India, you people out there, my friends who tune in to watch this show, do that. And that's you. That's the spiritual being that you are.
Yes. Yeah, and there are a lot of scientists, quantum physicists. You could Google it, Fred Allen Wolf and a bunch of others. What's happening now in science is a lot of scientists are starting to see that consciousness should not be thrown away from the study of life, that consciousness is really the new frontier. I mean, what is consciousness? What is doing all of this? What is orchestrating this phenomenal universe in balance and in such incredible artistry? Those questions are being asked by hard scientists now, and I think that we are little by little, as our society starts advancing in intelligence, in discriminating intelligence, which is really the evolution of man, when our discriminating intelligence starts evolving, the spirituality and science are not going to be enemies anymore. Faith and reason are not going to be enemies anymore. Because, when I have knowledge, when I had that experience of love within myself, that direct experience that was knowledge, I then had faith that I would experience that again. So
Yeah.
faith pulls us forward, but you have to have direct knowledge to be able to be pulled forward in something that makes sense to you. Otherwise, it's just you must believe, and if you don't believe, you're going to hell. And if you don't believe, you're not going to be part of the thought club. We have to kick you out because you're going to disturb all the other dreamers in their belief systems. Because a person that knows cannot be ruffled because they know.
Well, we're coming to the end of how much juice I have in the computer for this interview. This is, Wing It Productions, I guess. And I only want to I wanted to do a short show, but for sure, you're going to come back, aren't you?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, you have to talk to my lawyer, Ron.
Okay, yeah, good. Well,
Did
listen,
I
I'm
send
going
you
to
the
send.
contract yet? No.
Yeah, no, we'll get Brian back unless there's some short thing you want to take up as a send off. Is there anything you'd like to send us off with?
Yeah. All of this, really, when it boils down to it, the goal is happiness. That's really it. I mean, the goal of all spirituality, the goal of all philosophy is finding the truth and happiness. If happiness is not part of it, I don't want anything to do with it.
Well, that's a fair way to do it. And I'm going to tell you something. Before I sign off, let me do a little business because I know I've been off the air for a little bit. I have some other videos coming up. One of them will be a workout video. It's an exercise video. If you look at my website, therealronmiscavige.com, you'll see a thing I called Home Workouts for Veterans or Anybody. There's a new workout I'm going to put a video together on, and a new story time. So you're welcome to tune into those. Story time is just for your relaxation and enjoyment, and that's for your happiness, a little rest of the mind about the everyday activities and what we're living through right now. At any rate, from Brian Lampert and myself, I would like to wish all of you the best. Have a happy day and pursue that, as Brian just pointed out, and enjoy your life. And please tune in again. So, Brian. There you go. There's the ending music.
Right on, brother.
Okay. So, Brian, I'll see you the next time. And
that was fun,
let's
Ron. Thank you.
hey, let's make it next week, okay?
Okay, you got it.
If we can.
Yeah.
All right. From Brian and myself, see you on the next episode. Bye-bye for now.